My name is Gerald Thompson, and I'm 58 years old. For 30 years, I worked double shifts at the steel mill in Cleveland, Ohio, building what I thought was a good life for my family. I believed that hard work and sacrifice were the foundation of being a father. Every overtime hour, every missed weekend, every aching muscle was worth it, because I was providing for my son, Marcus. On his 25th birthday, I had planned the perfect surprise. I'd saved for months to buy him something special, something that would show him how proud I was of the man he'd become. But that day, instead of gratitude, instead of the celebration, I'd imagined my son looked me in the eye and said the words that shattered everything I thought I knew about fatherhood. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know your city or country. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences. Trust me, what happened next changed both our lives forever. Let me take you back to where this all began. My wife Sarah passed away from breast cancer when Marcus was just 12 years old. I remember that first night after the funeral, sitting at our kitchen table looking at this scared little boy who had just lost his mother and realizing that everything now fell on my shoulders. The bills, the homework help, the parent-teacher conferences, the scraped knees, the teenage heartbreaks, all of it. I made a promise to Sarah's memory and to Marcus that night. I would be both parents. I would work harder than any man should have to work to make sure he never felt the absence of what we'd lost. So I picked up every overtime shift the mill offered. 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week. My hands were permanently stained with grease, my back ached constantly, but I never complained. I was there for everything that mattered. Every baseball game, even when I had to leave work early and lose pay. Every school play, sitting in those tiny auditorium seats after a 12-hour shift. When Marcus made honor roll, I was the loudest parent cheering in that gymnasium. When he struggled with algebra, I sat at that same kitchen table every night working through problems with him, even though I hadn't touched mathematics since my own high school days decades earlier. My neighbor Dorothy, a retired teacher who lived next door, became like a grandmother to Marcus. She'd watch him after school when I couldn't get home in time, help him with his English papers, and make sure he ate something more nutritious than the frozen dinners I'd leave for him. Dorothy often told me I was doing too much, that I needed to take care of myself too, but I couldn't hear that advice. Being Marcus's father was all I had left of the family Sarah and I had dreamed of building together. My coworker Big Jim, a guy who'd been at the mill for 25 years, understood what I was going through. He had 3 kids of his own and would cover for me when I needed to leave for one of Marcus's events. "That boy's lucky to have you, Jerry," he'd tell me. "Not many single dads would sacrifice what you're sacrificing." When Marcus got accepted to Ohio State with a partial academic scholarship, I cried right there in the kitchen reading that acceptance letter. All those years of helping with homework, of pushing him to study, even when he wanted to quit, had paid off. The scholarship covered about 60% of his costs, which meant I needed to come up with nearly $15,000 a year for the remaining tuition room board and expenses. I took on a weekend job at a local hardware store. Saturdays and Sundays, after my regular mill shifts during the week, I'd spend 8 more hours mixing paint and loading lumber into customers' trucks. The hardware store owner, an older man named Pete, paid me cash under the table because he knew every dollar mattered. Some weeks I was working 7 days, nearly 90 hours total, but seeing Marcus thrive in college made every minute worth it. During his freshman year, Marcus would call me every Sunday evening. We'd talk for an hour about his classes, his new friends, his plans for the future. He wanted to major in business with a minor in photography, something that excited him. I didn't understand much about either field, but I listened to every word, asked questions, and encouraged his dreams. Those Sunday calls were the highlight of my week, proof that despite all the challenges, I was succeeding as a father. I remember his first Christmas break home from college. He seemed different, more confident, more worldly. He talked about his professors, his classmates, the opportunities he was discovering. I felt proud watching him grow into this articulate young man, even if sometimes I felt like I couldn't keep up with his expanding vocabulary and sophisticated ideas. But he was still my Marcus, still grateful for everything I'd provided, still appreciative of the sacrifices I'd made. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs started during Marcus's sophomore year, though at the time I convinced myself they were normal parts of growing up. Those Sunday phone calls that used to last an hour began getting shorter. 20 minutes, then 15, then sometimes just a quick check-in to let me know he was still alive and needed money for books or expenses. When he came home for visits, he seemed distracted, always texting on his phone instead of engaging in conversation. I'd ask about his classes, his friends, his future plans, and get one-word answers. Fine. Good. Maybe. I told myself this was typical college student behavior, that he was simply becoming independent, learning to navigate the world on his own. During his junior year, Marcus started bringing home his girlfriend, Brittany. She was a pretty girl from a wealthy family in Columbus, studying pre-law, with plans to attend an Ivy League law school. The first time I met her, I could see her eyes scanning our modest living room, taking in the 20-year-old furniture, the faded carpet, the simple decorations that Sarah and I had chosen together decades earlier. I tried everything to make Brittany feel welcome. I'd take them out to dinner at the nicest restaurants I could afford, places that cost me a full day's wages for a single meal. I'd ask her about her studies, her family, her future plans, trying to show interest in her world. But I could sense her discomfort with my work clothes, my calloused hands, my simple way of speaking. Marcus seemed embarrassed by these interactions. When I'd tell stories about his childhood, about the funny things he used to say or do, he'd cut me off with a sharp, "Dad, she doesn't need to hear about that." When I'd offer advice based on my life experience, he'd dismiss it with, "Things are different now, Dad. You wouldn't understand." The most painful moments came when Marcus would correct my grammar in front of Brittany. If I used a double negative or mispronounced a word, he'd interrupt with the proper version, speaking to me like I was a child who needed instruction. Brittany would smile politely during these corrections, but I could see the pity in her eyes, the way she looked at me like I was some relic from a world she'd never lower herself to inhabit. I started doubting myself during those visits. Maybe I wasn't good enough for the son I'd raised. Maybe all those years of working with my hands instead of my mind had left me unprepared to relate to the educated man Marcus was becoming. I began watching educational programs on television, trying to learn about topics they discussed. I bought books about business and current events, hoping to have something intelligent to contribute to their conversations. Dorothy noticed the change in Marcus, too. After one particularly uncomfortable visit, she invited me over for coffee and gently suggested that Marcus might be going through a phase where he was figuring out who he wanted to become. "Some young people have to reject their upbringing before they can appreciate it," she said. "He'll come back around Gerald. You raised him with good values." But the distance kept growing. Marcus's visits became shorter and less frequent. He'd drive down from Columbus, stay for one night, and leave the next afternoon, claiming he had studying to do or plans with friends. During these brief visits, he seemed like a stranger in the home where he'd grown up. He'd look around, with the same expression Brittany had, like he was seeing our humble surroundings through new, critical eyes. The final warning sign came during his senior year. I had called to congratulate him on making Dean's List again, something that had always made him proud in the past. Instead of excitement, his voice was flat, almost annoyed. Dad, I'm busy right now. Can we talk later? Later never came. When I called back a few days after that, he answered with clear irritation. What do you need, Dad? Not, how are you, or good to hear from you, but what do you need, like I was bothering him with my existence. As Marcus's 25th birthday approached, I decided this would be the perfect opportunity to bridge the growing distance between us. I had been secretly saving money for months, putting aside every spare dollar from my overtime pay and weekend hardware store job. In a coffee can, hidden in my bedroom closet, I had nearly $2,000 money I planned to spend on something that would show Marcus how much I believed in his dreams. Marcus had always been interested in photography, even as a child. I remembered him carrying around a disposable camera when he was 10, taking pictures of everything that caught his eye. During college, he'd mentioned wanting to get serious about photography, maybe even starting a side business, taking pictures for events and weddings. But professional camera equipment was expensive far beyond what a college student could afford. I researched cameras for weeks, reading reviews online at the library, talking to the staff at the camera store in downtown Cleveland. They recommended a Canon EOS with multiple lenses and professional accessories, everything a budding photographer would need to start a legitimate business. The total cost was $1,850, nearly every penny I'd saved, but seeing the excitement in Marcus's eyes would be worth any sacrifice. The party planning consumed me for days. I called Marcus's high school friends, the ones he'd grown up with in our neighborhood. Tommy Rodriguez, who now worked at an auto repair shop. Kevin Walsh, who'd become a firefighter like his father. Maria Santos, who was teaching elementary school. These were good kids from working families, people who understood the value of hard work and loyalty. I figured surrounding Marcus with reminders of his roots might help him remember who he really was beneath all that college sophistication. Dorothy offered to help with the cooking. We planned his favorite meal from childhood: barbecue ribs, corn on the cob, homemade coleslaw, and baked beans. For dessert, I would make his favorite chocolate cake from scratch, the same recipe Sarah used to use for his birthdays when he was little. The recipe card was still stained with flour and chocolate from all those years ago, one of the few things of hers I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I spent my entire Saturday before the party decorating the house. Streamers in his favorite colors, balloons tied to every chair, a big banner across the living room that said, "Happy 25th birthday, Marcus." I arranged the camera equipment in a special display on the dining room table, wrapped in elegant paper with a big bow. Everything had to be perfect. Dorothy came over that morning to help with the final preparations. As we worked in the kitchen, she gently asked if I'd talked to Marcus about the party. I realized I'd wanted it to be a complete surprise, but looking back, that might have been my first mistake. I was planning the kind of party that would have thrilled him at 15, not necessarily what would impress him at 25. "Gerald, honey," Dorothy said carefully, "are you sure this is what he wants? Maybe you should have asked him first." But I was too excited, too convinced that this grand gesture would fix everything that had gone wrong between us. I believed that if I just showed him how much I loved him, how proud I was of him, how much I was willing to sacrifice for his happiness, he would remember that I was his father, and I deserved his respect and affection. The morning of his birthday, I got up before dawn to start cooking. The ribs went into the slow cooker first, then I began preparing all the side dishes. The chocolate cake went into the oven at exactly the right time to be perfect when the guests arrived. I set the table with our best dishes, the china that Sarah and I had received as wedding gifts and only used for special occasions. By 2 o'clock, everything was ready. The house smelled incredible. The decorations looked festive, and the camera display was positioned perfectly for the big reveal. Tommy, Kevin, and Maria had all confirmed they'd be there by 3. Marcus was expected at 3:30, which would give me time to get everyone hidden for the surprise. I stood in my decorated living room wearing my best shirt and freshly shined shoes, feeling more hopeful about my relationship with my son than I had in months. At exactly 3:30, I heard car doors slamming outside. Through the front window, I could see Marcus getting out of a BMW that I didn't recognize, followed by Brittany and three other young people I'd never met. They were all dressed expensively, carrying themselves with the confidence that comes from never having worried about money or fitting in. Tommy, Kevin, and Maria were already there, looking somewhat out of place in my living room, but trying their best to be enthusiastic about surprising Marcus. When the front door opened and everyone yelled, "Surprise!" Marcus's face showed confusion rather than joy. He looked around the room, taking in the decorations, the childhood friends, the elaborate setup, and I could see something close to embarrassment cross his features. "Dad, what is all this?" he asked, but not in the delighted way I'd imagined. His tone carried a note of frustration, like I'd done something inappropriate. "It's your birthday party, son," I announced proudly. "I wanted to celebrate you properly." Marcus's friends from college stood awkwardly near the door. One of them, a tall young man wearing clothes that probably cost more than I made in a week, whispered something to another that made them both smirk. Brittany looked around our modest home with the same expression she always wore, but now she seemed particularly focused on the homemade decorations and simple furniture. I led Marcus to the dining room table where his gift was displayed. "This is for you, son. I know how much photography means to you." I watched his face as he unwrapped the professional camera equipment, expecting to see the excitement and gratitude that would make all those months of saving worthwhile. Marcus lifted the camera out of its box, examined it briefly, then handed it to Brittany, without even looking at me. "It's nice, Dad," he said, in the same tone someone might use to acknowledge a pair of socks. "Thanks." That was it. No excitement, no questions about the features, no acknowledgement of what this gift had cost me in time and money. He handed an $1,800 camera to his girlfriend, like it was something he'd picked up at a garage sale. The college friends began making subtle jokes about the party setup. One commented loudly about how quaint the decorations were. Another asked if the coleslaw was artisanal, in a tone that made it clear he was mocking our simple food. Brittany laughed at their comments, while Tommy, Kevin, and Maria looked increasingly uncomfortable. I tried to salvage the situation by suggesting we eat the meal I'd spent all day preparing. "Everyone, let's gather around the table." I made all of Marcus's favorites. But Marcus's friends continued their quiet commentary about the food, the house, the company. I could see Tommy clenching his fists, Kevin looking like he wanted to leave, and Maria staring at the floor in embarrassment for me. When I brought out the homemade chocolate cake complete with 25 candles, one of Marcus's friends actually laughed out loud. "How adorable," he said in a voice dripping with condescension. "Did you make this yourself?" "Yes, I did," I replied, still trying to maintain my dignity. "It's the same recipe his mother used to use." That's when Marcus finally snapped. He looked around the room at his childhood friends, at the decorations, at me in my best shirt, holding the cake I'd made with my own hands, and his face showed something I'd never seen before, pure disgust. "Dad, stop," he said loudly enough that everyone in the room heard. "Just stop with all of this." The room went completely silent. I stood there holding the birthday cake, 25 candles flickering, waiting for him to explain what I'd done wrong. "You want to know what I want for my birthday?" Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more agitated. "What I really want is for you to disappear from my life." The words hit me like a physical blow, I stood there holding that homemade cake, 25 candles still burning, and felt something inside my chest crack wide open. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is?" He gestured around the room at the decorations, at his childhood friends, at the simple meal I'd prepared. "I'm trying to build a professional reputation, Dad. I'm networking with people who matter, people who can help my career, and you're dragging me back to this." His college friends nodded in agreement, emboldened by his outburst. Brittany stood beside him with her arms crossed, looking satisfied that he was finally saying what she'd probably been thinking all along. "These people," Marcus pointed at Tommy, Kevin, and Maria, "they're from a life I'm trying to move past. And you," he turned to face me directly, "you calling me every week, showing up to my college events in your work clothes, telling your little stories about when I was a kid. Do you know what my friends think when they see you? Do you understand that your whole blue-collar act makes me look pathetic?" Tommy started to stand up clearly, ready to defend me, but I caught his eye and shook my head. "This was between my son and me. I've worked so hard to fit into a better world," Marcus continued. "And every time you show up with your mill worker hands and your simple way of talking, you remind everyone where I came from. Brittany's parents are lawyers. Her father went to Harvard. When I take her home for holidays, and she has to sit in this house, eat this food, pretend to care about your little stories, it's humiliating for both of us." I set the cake down on the coffee table, the candles still flickering. Around the room, everyone was staring at Marcus like he'd lost his mind. Even his college friends seemed uncomfortable with how cruel he was being. "You want to give me something for my birthday?" Marcus's voice was getting louder, more vicious. "Give me space. Give me the chance to become who I'm supposed to be without having to drag you along. Stop calling me every week like some clingy girlfriend. Stop showing up to my life uninvited. Stop embarrassing me with your desperate attempts to stay relevant." The room was completely silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I looked at this young man I'd raised, this person I'd sacrificed everything for, and realized I was staring at a stranger. "You raised me," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a cold whisper, "and I'm grateful for that. But that job is over now. I don't need a father anymore, especially not one who reminds everyone of how far I've had to climb." Brittany was smiling now, clearly pleased with Marcus's performance. His college friends looked around the room like they were witnessing something entertaining. But Tommy, Kevin, and Maria looked horrified. These were people who understood what it meant to have a parent sacrifice for your future, and they couldn't believe what they were hearing. "So happy birthday to me," Marcus concluded. "My gift from you is going to be your absence from my life. No more phone calls. No more surprise visits. No more trying to be part of a world where you don't belong. Can you do that for me, Dad? Can you give me that one thing?" I stood there looking at him for a long moment, this stranger wearing my son's face. 25 years of getting up before dawn. 25 years of working overtime to pay for his clothes, his food, his education. 25 years of putting his needs before my own, of believing that being a good father meant sacrificing everything for his success. And this was what I had raised. This was the result of all that love and sacrifice and devotion. A young man so ashamed of where he came from that he could humiliate the person who had given him everything in front of strangers on his birthday, in the home where he'd been loved unconditionally for 25 years. I looked around that room one more time, at Tommy, Kevin, and Maria, whose faces showed a mixture of rage and disbelief. At Marcus's college friends who were watching this family destruction like it was entertainment. At Brittany still smiling with satisfaction. At the decorations I'd hung with such hope, at the expensive camera lying forgotten on the table, at the homemade cake with its 25 candles slowly burning down. Then I walked calmly to the coffee table and blew out every single candle. "You're absolutely right, Marcus," I said, in a voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear me. "Your job as my son is over." I began moving through the room with deliberate precision. I took down the streamers, rolled them up neatly. I popped the balloons one by one, the sound making everyone jump. I folded the banner carefully and set it aside. Marcus's friends watched this methodical cleanup with growing discomfort, like they were beginning to realize they'd witnessed something uglier than they'd expected. I walked to the dining room table and picked up the professional camera, placing it back in its box with all the accessories I'd researched so carefully. I set the box on the coffee table next to the cake. "Since you don't want anything from me," I said, still in that calm, quiet voice, "you can return this camera tomorrow. The receipt is in the box. It should give you about $1,800 to spend on something that won't embarrass you." I went to the kitchen and turned off the oven, covered the food I'd spent all day preparing. In the living room, Tommy was staring at Marcus with undisguised disgust. Kevin was shaking his head slowly. Maria had tears in her eyes. "Tommy, Kevin, Maria," I said, "thank you for coming today. I'm sorry you had to witness this. Please take some food home with you. There's plenty." I retrieved my coat from the closet and put it on, slowly buttoning each button with care. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of my deliberate movements. "Marcus," I said, turning to face him one last time, "I raised you to be better than this. I taught you to treat people with respect, especially people who love you. But you're 25 years old now, old enough to make your own choices about the kind of person you want to be." I walked toward the front door, then paused with my hand on the doorknob. "When you decide you want to have a father again, you know where to find me. But I won't chase someone who doesn't want to be caught. I've spent 25 years proving my love for you. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life begging for yours." I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool autumn air. Behind me, I could hear Tommy's voice raised in anger, telling Marcus exactly what he thought of his performance. I heard Kevin and Maria gathering up their coats, preparing to leave. I heard Brittany's voice, shrill and defensive, trying to justify what had just happened. But I didn't look back. I got in my pickup truck, started the engine, and drove away from the house where I'd raised my son, away from 25 years of fatherhood, away from the life I'd built around loving someone who had just told me he wanted me to disappear. For the first time in my adult life, I had absolutely no idea where I was going or what I was supposed to do next. I drove for 3 hours without any destination in mind, just moving away from everything that had defined my life for the past 25 years. Eventually, I found myself at a gas station outside Akron, filling up my truck and realizing I had choices to make. I could go back home and wait for Marcus to cool down, pretend this was just a terrible misunderstanding. Or I could take his advice and truly disappear from his life. I called my brother Dave in Montana, a man I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Dave owned a small cabin near Glacier National Park, where he'd retired after selling his construction business. We'd never been particularly close, but he was family, and right then I needed to be somewhere that had nothing to do with the life I'd just lost. "Gerald, is everything okay?" Dave asked when he heard my voice. "Can I come stay with you for a while?" I asked without explaining anything. "Of course," he said immediately. "How long a while?" "I don't know yet." 2 days later, I was in Montana, sitting on Dave's porch, looking out at mountains I'd never seen before, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be if I wasn't Marcus's father. Dave didn't push for details, just gave me space and welcomed me into his quiet life. The first month was the hardest. I kept reaching for my phone to call Marcus, then remembering his words and putting it away. I'd start to worry about whether he was eating well, keeping up with his studies, managing his finances, then force myself to remember that he'd explicitly told me he didn't want my concern. Dave suggested I try some of the activities he'd discovered in retirement: hiking, fishing, photography. Photography. I laughed bitterly. That's what got me into this mess. But Dave persisted, pointing out that I'd bought all that expensive equipment to encourage Marcus's interest, not because I understood it myself. Maybe it's time to find out what you're interested in, he suggested. I started taking walks around the property with an old camera Dave had lying around, just pointing it at things that caught my eye. Mountains, wildlife, the changing light at different times of day. To my surprise, I had a natural instinct for composition, for catching moments that told stories. Dave convinced me to take a photography class in the nearby town of Kalispell. The instructor, a woman named Eleanor who'd moved to Montana after her husband died, saw something in my work that I didn't even know was there. "You have an honest eye," she told me after reviewing my first assignment. "You're not trying to impress anyone or prove anything. You're just showing what you see." Eleanor was 62, a retired English teacher from Denver, who'd discovered photography as a way to cope with grief. She understood loss, understood the process of rebuilding an identity after the thing that defined you was gone. We began spending time together outside of class, taking day trips to photograph landscapes and wildlife. "Tell me about your son," she said one afternoon, as we were photographing a family of deer. I found myself explaining the whole story, from Sarah's death through that terrible birthday party. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped me understand my own feelings better. "It sounds like you did everything right as a father," she said finally. "But maybe you forgot to do anything for Gerald." She was right. For 25 years, every decision I'd made was about Marcus's needs, Marcus's future, Marcus's happiness. I'd completely lost track of who I was as a person, separate from being a father. Back in Ohio, I maintained my word about not contacting Marcus. When Dorothy called to check on me, I was polite but clear that I was starting a new chapter. When she mentioned that Marcus had been asking about me, I told her he knew how to reach me if he wanted to. "He's been driving by the house," she reported. "I think he's realizing what he lost." "That's for him to figure out," I replied. "I'm not going to make it easy for him." My supervisor at the mill agreed to let me work remotely, handling some administrative duties from Montana. The pay was less, but my expenses were lower too, and Dave refused to let me pay rent. For the first time in decades, I wasn't working 70 or 80 hours a week just to survive. Eleanor and I grew closer over the months. She appreciated my work ethic, my loyalty, my straightforward way of approaching life. I valued her intelligence, her kindness, her understanding of loss. She didn't try to replace what I'd lost with Marcus, but she showed me that there were other ways to build meaningful relationships. By winter, my photography had improved enough that Eleanor suggested I start taking portrait sessions. "You're good with people," she observed. "You make them feel comfortable, help them show their best selves." I began photographing local families, couples, high school seniors. Word spread quickly in the small Montana communities. People appreciated that I wasn't just taking pictures, but capturing something real about their relationships, their personalities, their connections to each other. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had been interested in photography, but never pursued it seriously. Now I was building a business around the very thing he'd claimed to care about, using equipment I'd originally bought for him. 6 months after leaving Ohio, I was a different person. stronger, more confident, more aware of my own worth. I'd discovered talents I never knew. I had built relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, found purpose that didn't depend on being needed by someone who didn't value me. When Dorothy called to tell me that Marcus and Brittany had broken up, that he'd lost his job due to his entitled attitude, that he seemed lost and angry, I felt sad for him, but not responsible for fixing his problems. "He's asking about you more often," she reported. "I think he wants to reach out." "He knows my number," I replied. "If he has something to say to me, he can say it." 18 months after I left Ohio on a Tuesday morning in early spring, I was setting up lights for a wedding portrait session when Eleanor rushed into my makeshift studio. "Gerald, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern. I looked through the window and saw a figure I barely recognized. Marcus stood next to a beat-up Honda Civic wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt instead of the expensive clothes I remembered. He looked thinner, older, and there was something different in his posture. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. I walked outside slowly, giving myself time to process this moment I'd imagined dozens of times. Marcus looked up as I approached, and I could see that his eyes were red-rimmed, like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Hello, Dad," he said quietly. "Marcus?" I stopped about 10 feet away from him, maintaining distance, both physical and emotional. I drove all the way from Ohio to find you. Dorothy gave me the address." I waited. After what he'd put me through, after 18 months of silence, he was going to have to do more than show up and expect forgiveness. "I need to tell you some things," he continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I need you to know that I was wrong. About everything." I crossed my arms and waited for him to continue. "Brittany left me 6 months ago. She found someone richer, someone whose family had more connections. All those friends I thought were so important, they disappeared the minute I couldn't afford to keep up with their lifestyle anymore." He paused, struggling with the words. "I lost my job 3 months ago. Turns out having a college degree doesn't mean much if you can't work with other people, if you think you're better than everyone around you. My boss told me I was entitled and condescending. He said I treated people like they were beneath me." I could see tears forming in his eyes, but I didn't move to comfort him. That wasn't my job anymore. "I've been living in a studio apartment, working part-time at a coffee shop, just to pay rent. All those people I thought were so much better than you, than Tommy and Kevin and Maria, none of them cared when I needed help. But you know who showed up when I got evicted? Tommy did. Kevin did. They helped me move my stuff, bought me groceries, never once mentioned how I'd treated them at that birthday party." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "They told me what I already knew but was too proud to admit. That you were the best man they'd ever known. That any son who had a father like you should count himself lucky. That I was an ungrateful idiot who threw away the most important relationship in his life because I was ashamed of coming from good, honest, hard-working people." He looked around at the Montana landscape, at Eleanor's house, at the signs advertising my photography business. "Dorothy told me you'd built a new life. That you were happy, successful, had someone who cared about you. Part of me hoped that wasn't true, because it would mean I hadn't really hurt you. But seeing this, seeing how well you're doing without me, I realize that's exactly what I deserve." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, but what I saw was genuine remorse and a hard-earned understanding of what he'd lost. "What do you want from me, Marcus?" I asked. "I want to apologize. Really apologize, not just say the words, but mean them. I want you to know that everything I said at that birthday party was wrong." I was ashamed of the wrong things, proud of the wrong things, and I hurt the one person who never deserved to be hurt by me. He took a shaky breath. I want to ask if there's any way, any possibility, that someday you might be willing to let me try to earn back the right to call you my father. Not because I need something from you, but because I finally understand what I threw away. I looked at this broken young man, this stranger, who wore my son's face, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. I'm not the same person I was 18 months ago, Marcus, I said finally. I've built a life that doesn't revolve around being your father. I've discovered who I am when I'm not sacrificing everything for someone else's dreams. He nodded, tears flowing freely now. I know, and maybe that's what I needed to learn. That you're a complete person, not just my dad. That you deserved better than what I gave you. I gestured toward the small cafe in town. There's a place where we can get coffee. We can talk, but I need you to understand something first. If we're going to rebuild any kind of relationship, it's going to be on my terms, at my pace. I'm not going to chase you or beg for your attention or try to prove my worth to you ever again. I understand, he said quickly. I'm the one who needs to prove something now. We spent the next 3 hours in that cafe, talking more honestly than we had in years. Marcus told me about his struggles with pride, about how Brittany and her social circle had made him ashamed of his background, about the loneliness and failure that had finally forced him to examine who he'd become. I told him about my new life, about Eleanor, about the photography business, about discovering parts of myself I'd never had time to explore when I was working 80 hours a week to support his dreams. I'm proud of you, he said, as we prepared to leave. I should have said that years ago, but I was too stupid to see what everyone else could see. You're an amazing man, Dad. I'm sorry it took losing you for me to figure that out. I didn't invite him to stay, didn't offer to let him move to Montana, didn't immediately welcome him back into my life. Instead, I gave him my phone number and told him he could call me once a week if he wanted to work on rebuilding our relationship slowly. It might take years, I warned him, and it might not work at all. Trust isn't something you can fix with an apology. I know, he said, but I'd rather spend years trying to earn back your respect than spend the rest of my life knowing I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. Over the following months, Marcus kept his word. He called once a week and never asking for anything, just updating me on his life and asking about mine. He got a better job, started therapy, began the long process of rebuilding his character from the ground up. When he asked if he could visit again for Christmas, I said yes, but with conditions. He would stay in a hotel, not with Eleanor and me. He would respect our schedules and plans. He would understand that he was a guest in my new life, not the center of it. That Christmas visit went well enough that we began planning others. Gradually, carefully, we started rebuilding something that resembled a father-son relationship, but it was different now. Based on mutual respect rather than obligation, built on appreciation rather than expectation. Marcus never again made me feel like I needed to apologize for who I was or where I came from. He learned to value the lessons I'd taught him through example rather than lecture. And most importantly, he learned that love isn't something you can take for granted just because someone happens to share your DNA. The hardest lesson I had to teach him was that being someone's father isn't automatic or permanent. It's something you earn through your actions and something you can lose through them too. When he finally understood, that when he realized that having me in his life was a privilege rather than a right, that's when we started becoming family again. But it took losing each other completely before either of us could appreciate what we actually had. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them face the full consequences of their choices, even when that someone is your own child. Today, 3 years later, Marcus and I have a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. He's learned to be proud of his hard-working blue-collar father, and I've learned to set boundaries that protect my own dignity and happiness. Eleanor and I got married last spring, and Marcus walked her down the aisle because her own father had passed away years earlier. The greatest gift I ever gave my son wasn't that expensive camera or 18 years of sacrifice. It was showing him that actions have consequences, that love requires respect, and that sometimes you have to lose everything before you can understand what truly matters. If you're watching this and struggling with ungrateful children or family members who take your love for granted, remember that you teach people how to treat you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with dignity and let them discover what life looks like without your presence. Love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. Being a parent doesn't mean sacrificing your own worth for someone else's comfort. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop chasing people who clearly don't want to be caught. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever had to make the difficult decision to step back from someone you love? How did you find the strength to maintain your dignity in the face of rejection? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more real-life stories about family relationships and finding your worth. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they deserve better than being taken for granted. Remember, you can't force someone to appreciate you, but you can always choose to appreciate yourself. Sometimes that's the most important lesson of all. Thank you for listening, and remember that your worth isn't determined by who recognizes it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.